Okay, so degree day wise, we're going kind of back and forth again, but we're right about at normal averages for through the middle of June. So you can see here on base 42, this is right here the historical average data for Sparta, 1,056, and here is the actual Sparta data, 1,035. So just a half a day behind. We're going to go forward again with the current forecast that's coming our way for some very warm temperatures. And we're only about a half a day behind in base 50, which is just amazing to me because we were 2 weeks behind just a month ago. So the roller coaster weather continues with cooler than normal 1 week and warmer than normal the next. So here's the forecast from our local NBC affiliate, Channel 8. And going to be a nice day today. I think the temperatures are rising. You can feel it every day, a little bit more. And then I think definitely some warm weather is coming in and some very warm nights. Temperatures in the low to mid 60s. So hopefully you have some air conditioning so you can sleep better. What I don't see in the forecast is high levels of humidity, but that probably will come as we move into this warm weather. Here we are in West Michigan, so when it gets fairly warm, the humidity moves in, the dew point starts to increase. And then there are some showers. I'm going to show you in the next slide. These I think are going to be hit or miss. Nothing like last week with Tropical Storm Cristobal remnants moving through. I think it's going to be very, very light rainfall. So you're going to have to think about irrigation, and Phil's going to talk about that when I'm done. This is from Wonderground for the Sparta area. And here's what I wanted to point out for the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. You can see a couple tenths of an inch, not even a tenth of an inch for Sunday, and barely rain for Monday. So I think it's going to be fairly hit or miss with this potential for rainfall moving in. So, it just looks like the warm weather is going to continue. So I think they might be convection type of storms that, pop up as warm weather happens. You get some of those storms that pop up in the late afternoon. That we'll have to watch for the potential for trauma blight if you have any blocks out there that have any active blight. I'll talk about that in a second as well. So we're right here. If you're using the Apple Pest Guide, we're right. It's easy to follow this year because the degree days match up with the calendar dates. So let's just go through some of these insects. Plum curculio did a real number on some fruit this year and was very active because of the warm weather. But I think they did their work and moved on because because of the warm weather. They only come every spring with a certain amount of eggs, and once they have all the great weather to lay them, they're done. But in the meantime, I think they've done a good bit of damage on some tree fruits. So here's some plums that have a nice scar on them. It is plum curculio after all. Plum is their kind of favorite thing to go after. But peaches, sweet cherries, all those things were no exception this year. And there's quite a bit of damage in some apples, mostly borders along woodlots, as is typical. For codling moth, we're right in the peak of codling moth here. I have the chart, the degree day chart. This is degree day information from the Sparta station. So I set the biofix on May 25th. Some of you may have been a little bit earlier, some of you may have been a little later, so I try to kind of shoot the middle there for an average for the ridge. And so here we are at the end of yesterday. We crossed over that kind of 350 degree day mark, which usually indicates we're about 20 or 25% of the way through egg hatch. I extrapolated out some forecasted data and some normal averages for degree days past the forecast to kind of get you to where peak egg hatch. And so peak egg hatch will be the end of next week, likely. So we're coming into some pretty key timing for for you to make sure fruit is well protected for codling moth. If you're doing mating disruption, you need to follow your trap numbers to tell you if moths are getting into those 1X traps. That means you may need to overlay some type of cover spray. If you're doing conventional materials, if you're catching more than 5 moths accumulated in any traps, that means you're over threshold for codling moth. So I do think we have a good 3 weeks probably of codling moth to deal with yet. The other thing I want to mention about codling moth is the more you do to manage this first generation, the less you have to do to manage the second generation. So by eliminating as many as you can and being real tight with your program, that helps you with second generation, which they lay their eggs directly on the fruit, and they can move immediately into fruit and cause quite a bit more damage. So keep the ball rolling here for codling moth. Aphids seem to be doing very well. I now can find aphids in all the different tree fruits. Green apple aphids are out there and present now. They usually show up a little about first cover. And woolly apple aphids can be found. They're not really very easy to find, but if you know where to look, where you've had problems with them in the past, you likely find them there. And going after them now will reduce the potential for big populations in later generations. Woolly aphids are usually more of a problem. We notice them more around harvest. However, you need to start knocking them back now. The warm weather and all this rapidly expanding shoot growth it's a nice smorgasbord for aphids to have lots to feed on. I do find beneficials feeding on the populations as well, which is good. They're helping. But you need to stay on top of aphids this year. Oblique banded leaf roller, a lot of them are pupating. Now if you pull apart leaves, you can find pupae in there, and they have now started flying. I just set a biofix for yesterday. I've been hearing of people catching a few over the past 4 or 5, even 7 days. But they really took a big jump forward here in the last couple of days. So I went ahead with a regional biofix. And this, of course, the regional biofix was just yesterday. So all of this is in green, which is predicted. Just to give you an idea, to remind you of how oblique banded leaf roller develops. When we get to about 220, that's peak moth flight. But the most important degree day, or the most important part of the model, is when we get to 400, 425 degree days, base 42 we use for OBLR. That's the start of early egg hatch. And if you have blocks that you feel you just can't get ahead of OBLR larvae in the last couple years, and they are starting to build a little bit, people ask me more and more about them over the last couple years. Using this earlier timing will help you get a head start on the population. Normally, about a week later or so is when we'll see visible larvae, and that's traditionally when you find larvae, you can spray for them. But by the time you get to that point in some high pressure blocks, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk about it next week is our last meeting, so I'll spend some more time on it next week too, but I just wanted to let you know what's coming up for OBLR. So a couple weeks out before you need to worry about it too much. San Jose scale, from our biofix that I set back on June 1st, we're at 230-ish degree days, base 51, typically around 400s when those crawlers start to emerge. They can be very hard to find. One way you can look for them is to put some black electrical tape around branches, as I'm showing up here in this top picture. You put it sticky side out, and sometimes you can even spray it with a little Tanglefoot, but not too much because they're so small, they get gooped up in there and they're hard to see. And if you have good eyes or a good hand lens, this is what they look like on that tape, really close up. And you need to do this on branches that you know you've had some problems with active scale. You can't just go out to any limb in the orchard. You have to do it where you know the populations are, or you're going to be disappointed and you won't be able to find the crawlers. So for scale, the timing for those crawlers is around according to the model anyway, 25th or 26th of June. there's a few ways you can go after this first generation of scale. So if you're going to use something that's systemic, like a product like Movento, you want that has to be taken up by the tree, and you really need to follow the label for that product. You need to deliver a lot more water probably than you think, because it has to be taken up by the leaves and tissues and get into the plant. And then as the insects start feeding, they get a dose and it kills them. So it's very important that it gets into the plant. The other thing is that you need to have that probably on ahead of when you expect crawlers to start emerging, to give time for it, a few days for it to be taken up by the plant tissues. And then the second type of materials are more contact base for San Jose scale, and they're usually timed for peak crawler emergence, which will be a few weeks after this, or at 600 to 700 degree days. I didn't extrapolate that out in here. I probably should have, but it'll be more like the 7th or 10th of July, depending on weather, of course. So there's a couple of ways you can go after San Jose scale, and those are just a few of the. I just mentioned one material, but that Movento in particular, because it's systemic, you need to go after it a little bit differently than the contact pesticides. Oriental fruit moth, we're kind of moving in between first and second generation now. So we're at 520 degree days since our biofix. So this is a good time for you to change your lures, particularly in stone fruits. And if you haven't put any out in apples, which is okay, because the first and second generation really aren't that big of a deal in apples, except perhaps in blocks that have been disrupted for a long time. Sometimes OFM can move in when you're not putting traditional spray covers on for codling moth. But it's a good time to change those lures out, so you know what's going on for second generation. And the degree day models are showing us we expect trap numbers to start beginning to increase again as second generation starts. And we should be winding up here with first generation egg hatch. So your cover sprays aren't quite as crucial for the next maybe 10 days or so. And then we'll have to step that back up again as we move into later in July. I will say I have not seen very much flagging this year. Typically I'll see it in young trees, or even in nursery trees for apples, young trees for peaches. And other places around the state have said the same thing. So maybe OFM is, maybe they had a difficult time this spring with the heat or the cold. You pick, because we had a lot of each. European red mite. This is one I'm really kind of keeping my eye on, and I think you guys should too. You can find all stages now. They move very quickly and developed very quickly with some of the warm weather that we had. So the threshold for June is only 2.5 mites per leaf, or moldiles. It includes the nymphs and the adults. It doesn't include eggs. And when we get to July here in a few days, that jumps up to 5. But this warm weather and dry weather that we're expecting is just perfect for mites to move quickly in their population. And I found this table that just correlates temperature with how quickly mite populations can expand. So when the average daily temperature, so that's high and low in an average, is around 55, it can take, they spend 19 days in the egg stage, and then when they get to adults, so a total of 40 days for one turnover of a life cycle. So that's okay, a month and a half. But when the average temperature gets closer to 80, which that would be, if we have 90 degree days and 70 degree nights, that's 80 for an average temperature. That severely is shortened. It goes from 40 days down to 70. We're probably going to fall in this middle range here for the next several days. So a couple of weeks for them to turn over a generation, as opposed to more than a month. So you can see here that they can create a lot of generations per season between June and September when those temperatures are higher. Lower temperatures, 3 to 4 generations per season, I think we can manage that. And we have had slightly cooler summers the last couple years, and so mites have not been a big deal for us. But this warm weather in May and June, it gives them a chance to get a foothold, and I'm just afraid they're going to take off on us. So definitely be keeping track of mite levels. There are charts available to help you. If you need them, please reach out to me. It's old information, but good information. It was put together by some Cornell experts several years ago, but we still use it to help us do mite counts so that you can come to find out if you need to treat or keep sampling. Also takes into consideration if beneficials are seen in those populations too. White apple leafhoppers, I can find all the stages, and now I do see potato leafhoppers, both the adults. I think they showed up from last week's storms, but they also showed up a couple weeks ago from storms, and you can see what I think are nymphs of potato leafhopper. I don't know, they all look alike to me. Some people say potato leafhoppers run sideways and white apple leafhoppers run forward. I'm not sure I believe that, but it doesn't matter. The management is really all the same. The damage they do is a little bit different, but in the end, the management is the same. And just keep an eye out for them, particularly in trees that aren't getting your routine cover sprays, like your young trees that aren't yet in bearing. Sometimes leafhoppers can really slow down the growth in those trees when you're trying to maximize your, trying to get to that top wire on those young trees. Tarnished plant bug, I think I talked about this last week, and I can see a little bit of damage in peaches. This is an old picture, but I see the little bit of, anytime peaches get injured, of course, they get gummy sap. And so you can see some of that on some of these peaches, and I think that's some initial stings. And then over time, that will get more sunken. I don't think it's bad or anything. I just see it this year, a little bit of damage in peaches. I left black stem borer in there because people that are doing wide-scale trapping are still catching them, but they are decreasing. They seem to have a big release with the last time we had nice warm weather, but they're finishing up, and the adults are becoming less active now that they're all in the trees. And the other borers that we watch are all flying now. Dogwood borer started flying in pretty low numbers, and we time those trunk applications for these at peak flight of the various adults. So for your stone fruits, lesser peach tree borer, regular peach tree borer, or sometimes called greater peach tree borer, and American plum borer, sometime next week or the end of June would be a good idea. And then for dogwood borer, usually around the 4th of July is a good rule of thumb for borer sprays if you're catching significant numbers of those, or if you're seeing quite a few larvae in the burr knots of some of the M9 clone rootstocks. So I'm going to move on to apple scab. I hope all of you were happy to see my email last week calling apple scab to an end. So I'm just showing you the Sparta Station data. I do think with the heavy rains that we had last week, so we had, the Sparta Station had 2 inches of rain, some other stations had a little bit more, a little bit less than that. I only caught 7 spores in that heavy rain. And so that was the tail end of, I think, of the spores that needed to be released yet. And then I continued to monitor them again. We had rain that started on the 11th. I know it was an evening rain. However, there were no spores. I will watch them for 1 or 2 more rains. It always makes me nervous to do that because I've already called it off, but I'll let you know. I'll be honest and let you know if I do find spores. If by any chance I do, I'm sure it'll be very, very small numbers. And in your commercial blocks where you've been managing scab very well, you have less overall inoculum than I do in this great block that I have caught some really wonderful spore numbers in again this year. So the one thing I did want to point out is the lesions from these last couple of rains. I think this one is there, the one from the it was a light infection back on the 3rd of June. I'm looking in unsprayed trees, so it's getting to look, it's a lot of sheet scab now, so it's kind of hard to tell new infections from old ones. But we really need to get through to next week before we potentially see any of the last scab lesions that might yet show up. So just for those of you that are scouting carefully, just watch closely to make sure that nothing shows up as far as primary scab. So scab is over for the 2020 season. It actually went a little faster than I expected since we started out late. I thought maybe we would go later, but it looks like the spores, all that warm weather and all the rain we had really developed them quickly. This is the final printout from RimPro for the whole season. So this big red bar down here is a full complement of spores, and then of course over time the spores mature. That's the bright red, and these are the immature spores, the dark red. And over time that slowly gets smaller until we got to this last rain from last week. You can see there's a little blip out here. I think I have it blown up for the next rain that might happen over the weekend. There are, as far as I can see, I blew it up as far as I could. I don't see any yellow bars in there, so they're not predicting any additional spores because I think they all came out from the end. But again, it's a rain event, so I'll just keep an eye on it, but I think we're done for the year. If you have some scab, which I would not be surprised to see some primary scab in blocks, we had some very challenging infection periods this year. You have to keep your full rate of Captan on until terminal bud set, and those fruits get waxy, typically mid to late July. And the trees will slow down, and you'll not have so much lush growth that will be likely to be infected, and fruits become a little more hardened off with that waxy coating. And so then you can maybe stretch those fungicides out. But if we do get extended rainfall, it only takes about 6 hours in summer temps to get a secondary scab infection. So if you do have some scab, you do need to keep a good layer of Captan kind of present to make sure that fruit is not infected. And then as we get towards harvest, we lose that kind of natural resistance, and leaves start breaking down, and fall rains come, and then we can get additional scab infections close to harvest, and that leads to pinpoint scab at harvest or coming out of storage after a few months. So just keep that in mind. I just briefly wanted to mention fire blight. I'm still amazed at the small amount of fire blight that's out there after this event. Every station in West Michigan had 4 or 5 days of infections, one after the other, and we had rainfall during the end of bloom, or in bloom if you were farther to the north, with very high EIPs and very little blossom blight showing up. In fact, I think I mentioned last week, if I didn't, I'll say it now, some of our most susceptible varieties are good and clean from fire blight, and it's some of the marginal varieties, or those that you don't normally even cover for fire blight, like Red Delicious or Spies, or even perhaps Goldens. They can be sometimes get a little bit of fire blight. Those are the varieties that we're seeing a little fire blight in. So don't forget to look at those. You don't normally see Red Delicious with fire blight, but this would be the year you might, because they're not totally immune to it, but when you have conditions like we had over these 4 days here, this is the Sparta data, that can overcome that, what we think of as more natural resistance, but they're not completely immune. The other reason I put this in here is, so here on June 7th, 8th, and 9th, if you had any blossom blight from these bloom infections, it should have shown up, and you should be seeing it by now. The other thing was the wind from last week when we were on the call, and I got literally blown off this Zoom meeting by the wind. I put wind in, and what that starts in Mary blight is over here in the last column, it starts a trauma event. And so just putting in forecasted data for the next couple of days to get this through to 100, that shows that's the potential when trauma should be showing up. So if something got cooked up last week with the wind and the storms, and if you had hail, you should be seeing that, especially with the warm temperatures that are coming our way. I would think by today, tomorrow, Friday at the least, Today, maybe you'll see this early wilting symptoms today or tomorrow. And by the end of the day, it gets a little more crispy looking. And then within a few days, you might see some additional oozing. So do be on the lookout for that in case there was some trauma that got some fire blight cooked up, because tissues were really tender last week, and you just want to make sure that you're staying clean. The other thing is, like I said, all blossom blight should be out there. Keep an eye on newly planting trees that maybe are out of sync with bloom. They can still get blossom blight. Trauma blight is something you need to keep in the back of your mind until you get to terminal bud set. So we use Oxytet ahead of those known trauma events. There are products that fit into what we call biologicals, or those acquired resistant products like Actigard and LifeGuard. Those have to go on ahead of a trauma event, preferably a few days ahead. You can use streptomycin after a trauma event, very little, or before, but you have 24 hours to get it on after. I think you're going to get very little help from that if you have known resistance in those blocks. And then if things really get bad with, if we get hailstorms or anything, copper after a trauma event might be something you need to consider. I always consider that a last ditch effort, because you could possibly end up with some rusting on fruit. So, but then you're stopping it from affecting trees. As mentioned in the past, and I think Phil said the same thing, keep your apogee applications on until trees get to terminal bud set. You may even, just because of the pressure this year from the high risk at blossom and then the storms we had last week, may even bump up your rates an ounce or two if you're doing a kind of a every 2 or 3 week application with your apogee. And then maybe go easy on fertility in some of your high risk varieties until you're sure that you're out of the window for fire blight. And then I told you last week I would talk about summer diseases. Someone asked the question. So there is a model we can use. It comes out of North Carolina from Turner Sutton. And it starts the model 10 days after petal fall. So on EnviroWeather, that uses 511 degree days. But if you go to the model on EnviroWeather, you can put your own date in. So here's Standale, the station for that. And it chose, based on degree days, that the date of petal fall was the 23rd of May. And then 10 days after that, it starts adding up wetting hours. Anytime there's wetting hours for more than 4 hours. So if it's 3 hours, 3.5 hours, none of it gets counted. If it's 4 hours or more, it all gets added in. And so it started doing that for Standale 10 days after the 23rd was June 3rd. And since then, you can see the dates and the number of hours. The accumulated wet hours are 76. It also looks at rainfall. That's most important for your second application. So once this gets to 240 or so accumulated wet hours, that tells you when symptoms could start showing up. The disease starts to express itself, the sooty blotch or the fly speck. So you need to get your fungicide on ahead of that. I like to use 200 as a kind of guide, so that when this gets to 200 hours, you need to put a fungicide on. And then the model actually has a place in here where you can put the date of that fungicide, and then it'll start adding those hours up again. And after you get 2 inches of rain and X amount of numbers of hours again, that tells you when your second application needs to go on. So it's an effective model, and it's nice if you get a really dry summer. It can help you stretch out that summer fungicide a bit, or not use it if you don't need to. So here's a summary of all the stations in the Grand Rapids area. I was kind of surprised that we didn't have more hours of wetting than we did, but they're quite variable across all the stations. So let's just hit Sparta here, since a lot of you look at that station. Petal fall date was the 25th, so the start of the model 10 days after petal fall on the 6th, only 28 hours of wetting since the start of the model, and we've had quite a bit of rain since then, but only 28 hours of wetting, so you need to get closer to 200. The Grant Station, which is always reads wetter than everything else, is up to 100 already, and it is in a lower elevation spot, so there's probably some humidity built into that. And some dew. It actually has to measure leaf wetness during that time. Fremont's up a little bit higher as well. And then like Standale is 76, and some of them don't have very many hours, 35 at Alpine, and the Sparta Tower is 22, which is a little bit different than the actual Sparta station. So you can go and find that on and fine tune your summer disease applications. And then just one final thing, since I don't talk about sweet cherries too much, but we're starting to see some fruit color. And we talked about this on our fruit team call yesterday, that sweet cherries, I think they took a hit this year with cold damage. And so the crop isn't as heavy as I think anybody would like to see it. But this warm weather coming up is going to be perfect for brown rot. The only good thing would be the humidity, I think, isn't going to be, we'll see what that's going to turn into, but the heat, as fruit starts to ripen, the sugars come up, brown rot can really get going. And then the other problem will be, birds are always a problem in sweet cherries, but if you have a lesser crop, you still have the same amount of birds who are going to probably eat the same amount of fruit. But if you have a lighter crop, the percentage of that damage then is higher in the end. So you might want to step up anything, whatever you can do to manage birds in those sweet cherry blocks where you do have a decent crop that you plan to harvest. So I'm going to end there. Phil, you can take it away.
Well, thank you, Amy. One thing I remember is Bill Shane, I think, talked about borers up in the tops of trees he's seeing this week.
Oh yeah, the ambrosia borers, which was unusual to see them up in the upper portion of the canopy as opposed to just trunks. But I think he wasn't sure exactly what type of beetle they were yet.
Right, but they're doing some flagging up in the tops of trees.
Yeah, yep, so something to, that's a good point. If they start flagging trees, you know, your first thought might be fire blight, but it could be something else, so look a little closer.
We saw some silver leaf and some viruses as well just recently. So
yep.
Okay, I'm going to talk about hedging here for a second. We always like to, the recommendation is the hedge at the 12th leaf stage, which we are now past, but this is the hedging window timing of a year. The other thing that they tell you is the hedge on the longest day of the year, which is the summer solstice, which is the 21st of June. So between now and the 21st of June is a prime time for hedging trees. And we do this to narrow up the canopy, increase the light distribution in the tree. And if we do it at this time, it doesn't create that heavy vigor response. It does reduce your pruning costs and stimulate flowering. When you make a hedging cut, we hope to, especially at this time of year, you will get darts will come off the hedging cut, and oftentimes they produce flowers on the tips of those short darts. And of course, it improves fruit quality, summer hedging. So you can hedge any time of year, actually. But the June summer solstice 12th leaf stage, the shoots are 8 to 12 inches long, and it's just is excellent timing, reduces vigor. It produces a lot of short shoots with flower buds, and it maximizes flower bud initiation for next year. Sometimes we cut off apples, 5 to 10 fruits per tree when you have that. So, and be mindful of fire bite risk at this time. If you do happen to run into you hedged, get them covered up with some sort of bactericide or copper or something like that. You can do it in June, you can do it in July, you can do it in August. But June tends to be the best for especially getting flower buds for next year. When you get into July and August, sometimes the limbs get stiff, and so you come through with a hedger and your hedging bar catches the limb, and after it cuts it, it flips back and flips the apples off the limb. So June is a very low risk time to do it from losing fruit, other than if it's a tip bearing variety and that's where your fruit is. In August, it even gets worse, but you let a lot of light in, you get better fruit quality, better color, and sometimes it will reduce fruit size, diameter. This is what the hedging cuts looked like last year on trees. This one here in the center where the shoot is ripped, that's a great place for fire blight to get in. All of these wounds will be a good fire. This one's cut nice and clean here on the right, but those are all susceptible trauma blight type of wounds. So be careful when you do that. And only if you run into trouble, a storm shows up that you weren't expecting, you probably should cover those up with fire blight protection, but try to pick the dry times. If after you hedge like this, within 24 hours, that wound dries up and is not susceptible to fire blight. I want to move on to irrigation. I've shown you this slide before. In June, we typically use about 3,000 gallons of water per acre for fully bearing trees. Sometimes we can get up to 4,000, and it probably will the next 3 days. And it did before the heat that we had a week ago. But July, which is coming up here, that's when we really used the most water this season, typically 4,500 gallons of water per day in a fully bearing orchard. Now, an acre inch is 27,000 gallons of water per acre inch. During June, we need about an inch of rain every week in order to satisfy our needs for the tree's needs for water. In July, we need about 1.25 inches per week in order to satisfy the water demand. And if it's really hot, it's going to be 1.5 inches, but basically it's about 1 inch this month and about 1.25 inches next month, and then it settles back down in August to around 1 inch, 1.25 inches. Here is where we are right now. This model is available on NUA website, the Cornell site. This is a better version of irrigation needs for apples, or I should say the apples' demand for water, than the old system that we used to use, which was based on hay. And then we extrapolated that to the tree. So this one is better predicts what the tree is actually demanding and using. So you can see here on June 17th, where we are today, the trees are going to need 4,256 gallons of water for a fully bearing orchard, tall spindle orchard each day. And when it gets to 27,000 that accumulates, it needs 1 inch. You got to replace that with 1 inch. And you can see it's going to be 4,000 each day for the next 3 days. Then it gets down to 3,600, and it's predicted to be 2,400 on those cool days coming up here. And it's supposed to rain again on the weekend. This is where we are today for water evapotranspiration for apples, full bearing apples. You can see here the 1 inch line. That is today's prediction. The trees have used 1 inch of water since last week. That means if you're in sandy soils, and you probably have already started your irrigation, you need to start it now to replace that inch. A sandy soil has about 1 inch of water holding capacity available to the trees per acre foot of soil. And with these high density orchards here, we're just using the first foot of soil as being our main water holding capacity area. By next week at this time, we will be deficit 2 inches. That's where clay soils need to be started. I think you should start clay soils now as well. Stay ahead of the water needs and don't let it get into a wilting point situation or a water deficit. And we're supposed to get rain here. Amy said rain on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever. And it's only going to be about a 1/4 inch. Won't amount to much. Only 70% of that is predicted to be effective rain for the tree demand. Therefore, that's not going to amount to a hill of beans to the tree. It might provide a half a day's worth of moisture to the tree. So get that irrigation going and keep it going, especially in the sand. If you're in sandy soil, water more often for a shorter period of time. If you need to water an acre for let's say 8 hours in order to irrigate 1 inch of water, on sandy soils, you might want to split that into 3 applications and put on 1/3 of an inch each time. Now I'd like to move on to apple maturity prediction for 2020. It's a little early to do this, but I wanted to explain what we typically have. In a normal year, the old full bloom date for McIntosh is May 15th. However, the last few years, with global warming, that average date over the last 20 years has moved up to May 10th, being the average date. Over the last 40 years, it's May 15th. From full bloom until 30 days after full bloom, we look at the temperatures, the average temperature during that time period. And this is how the model predicts when harvest will be. It takes the full bloom date and it adds the average temperature above normal. So if it's 1 degree warmer than normal, then harvest is advanced by 1 day. If it's 5 degrees warmer than normal, then the harvest is advanced by 5 days from the full bloom date. So where are we in 2020? In 2020, May 19th was the full bloom date, give or take a day or so. We were 4 days late on full bloom on our 40-year average, 9 days late on our 20-year average. But we were that should have said degrees. We were 4 degrees warmer during this 30-day period, which is
hanging out somewhere south.
Right now. So that means our harvest date, according to the bloom date, would be 4 days late, but it's 4 degrees warmer. And so therefore it should be a normal harvest date. And this is sort of a quick early prediction because the models are not available on the website yet, which actually does all the calculations for us. So we're predicting pretty much normal harvest dates for here at Sparta. There is one model that is up on the website right now on EnviroWeather for Deerfield. It's predicting that McIntosh will be ripe on September 9th, Jonathan's on the 23rd, and Red Delicious on the 29th of September for Deerfield. That's fairly normal. The Macs might be a couple days ahead of their normal harvest date. The Jonathans are right on the money for the Deerfield harvest date, average normal. But Red Delicious is a day or so ahead of their normal harvest date. So it's so far starting out to be just about a normal harvest period predictions for this year. And last year, I think we were 5 days behind normal. These are the normal dates for Grand Rapids area. Galos would be September 10th, McIntosh the 15th. And next week, we will have actual predicted harvest dates from EnviroWeather to help you with your planning of fall sprays, harvest, and PGR applications such as Harvesta or Retain. I'd like to end right there and see if there's any questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody has questions, you can turn your mics on and ask them. Thank you for that, Phil. That was a lot of information.
Yeah, you bet, Amy. I'm going to turn it back to your screen. So,
Okay. Oh, my dog is seeing something. I don't think anything. Sorry about that.
so we're getting to summer. Day after day, we'll be doing the same thing here over the next 2 months. I don't think there'll be much hand thinning. There might be a little bit. It looks like the apple trees have thinned down on their own pretty much. And of course, where we did chemically thin, it looks like we thinned off a few too many.
No questions from the group? Well, okay. Then we have, oh, here's a question. Water requirements for a new apple orchard.
Okay, let's say you have a 1-year apple orchard you just planted this year. You need about 10% of the requirements that I just listed. So instead of having an inch that you need per week, you need 1/10 of an inch per acre on a newly planted orchard. The difficulty there is a newly planted orchard doesn't have a root system much. And so you'll need to irrigate them more often, 3 to 4 times a week, and to put on that water. It'd be better than trying to put on an inch of water all at one time on newly planted orchards. Try to keep them in the irrigation schedule more often, just as you would if on sandy soil. So if you're on a sandy soil and a new orchard, you might want to irrigate them every other day. And a 2-year-old orchard probably would use about 20% of the full orchard, and a 3 to 5-year-old probably about 50%. And once you get 5 years or older, you need to treat them like a full bearing orchard.
Very good. I don't see any other questions. So with that, I think I'm going to call it to an end, and then next week will be our last meeting. Hopefully you can all join us, and then from then on we'll have to figure out what we're doing for the rest of summer, I guess, since Phil and I, well, Phil's retired. He can do whatever he wants, I think. So, and I want to thank you, Phil, for coming back to give all your great reports. I appreciate it more than you know, probably.
Thank you, Amy. You do a great job too.
Yeah, well, I'm still getting paid. You're retired. Well, you're on contract coming back, so.
The fruit industry is in great hands with you guys.
Yeah, well,
you and the rest of the team.
I think I learned most of it from you, so I'm either blessed or doomed, one way or the other.
You probably do.
Okay, so one more meeting, and then we'll just see what happens after that. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.